Okay, so welcome back to the Kansas Biological Survey weekly seminar. Thank you for those of you who came, the few, the proud, who managed to make it in between a snow day and spring break. You should be proud of yourselves. So I just want to introduce Vadim Karatayev, who did his undergrad at Cornell and his PhD at UC Davis under Marissa Baskett in 2019, finished in 2019. He's also done a postdoc at University of Guelph, and he's been a visiting researcher in the Netherlands. He recently, as in last fall, joined my group here at KBS, so you may see him around, especially if you start coming back into the building. He's a quantitative ecologist. He's published on a wide range of interesting topics. Just a smattering of those include kelp dynamics, social dynamics of climate change mitigation, COVID mitigation strategies, and alternative stable states and ecosystems. So he has wide-ranging interests. Okay, so here he is, Vadim Karatayev. Maybe you want to check with them what they're seeing to make sure that
yes. Okay, so hopefully this. All right, so hopefully you guys can see the screen. Thank you, Dan, for that kind of introduction. And again, thank you all so much for, again, coming on a Friday between a snow day and break week. Yeah, it's just settling in this past fall. Really excited to hopefully meet many of you in person in the next few weeks. Yeah, and I'm really excited to tell you my research path so far. This is essentially a version of my job talk at the moment. If you think that, for graduate students, if you think that it's good, it's because at some point you will spend maybe several years making this PowerPoint. But if there's skeps that things that are confusing, I'd love to know about that too. So thank you for that. So in ecology, one of the most striking patterns that we see is the same ecosystems can, similar kinds of ecosystems can exhibit very different configurations. So we have grasslands and they can become overgrazed and be kind of barren. Lakes, very famously, of course, really nice and clean, clear water, or they can turn really green and turbid. And in kelp forests, sometimes we have lush, giant forests of kelp plants and about 100 species that uniquely rely on kelp for a habitat, or we can have urchin barrens, where we lose all the kelp and all those species associated with it. And the other really striking pattern in ecology also is that the same ecosystems can transition back and forth between these completely different configurations. This is something we're seeing more and more all the time now. We've seen this hundreds of times. We have a whole database of it. So because of this, very early on, we started asking, maybe kind of this picture that we have an ecosystem and it has some stable configuration that it always comes back to, returns to. Maybe that picture is incomplete. So maybe under some conditions, ecosystems can actually exhibit multiple different steady states. So now where we end up, which state we end up in, depends on where we start. Okay. So for example, here with a kelp forest, we have this key feedback, positive feedback loop, where if you have more kelp plants, then the herbivory level on any single plant goes down, and that leads to a further increase in kelp plants. But if you go past the tipping point from left to right, the tables turn. And now when we have fewer kelp plants, more herbivory on any given plant, and that leads to a further decline in kelp plants. So these kinds of feedback loops are what create alternative stable states. Now, alternative stable states also explain why ecosystems might fail to recover to their kind of pristine steady state after a disturbance. So on the left here, if we do not have alternative stable states, whenever we have this kind of press disturbance or a pulse disturbance, the system always comes back. So if we gradually change conditions from left to right, the system degrades, but we can always reverse that very easily. And the same thing with a pulse disturbance. When we do have alternative stable states, we find that when we have a press disturbance or a pulse disturbance, we have a shift in the state of the system. And coming back from that shift is very difficult. So with this red line on top of this press disturbance, initially not many things happen until we fall off this cliff. And to get back to that pristine state, you need a very large reduction or a very large change in the system. So with alternative stables, when we have alternative stable states, ecosystems have a limited ecological resilience. In other words, there's a limited magnitude of disturbance that they can withstand and still recover from. If the disturbance is too big, they become trapped for long periods of time in this kind of degraded state. Okay, so this is one of the reasons we talk about alternative stable states so much is that we want to know which ecosystems are going to be robust and recover from disturbance and which ecosystems maybe won't recover from disturbance. This is a qualitative issue of resilience. So it's interesting for conservation, it's very important. But the other thing, as an ecologist, basic ecologist, the thing that my main motivation for saying this is if we have this kind of situation where we have two distinct configurations that the system can be in under the same set of conditions, that's like a really weird, bizarre telltale sign that something important is happening in the system. Okay, we have these really strong feedbacks. And if we can figure out what they are, we'll learn an awful lot about how the system works. Okay, so all of this noise about cycles, chaos, things like that in ecology, they don't happen very often, but when they do, it's very weird. And so we can, that shows there's some really strong processes in the system that we want to understand. That's kind of the other motivation. So we've been studying alternative stable states in ecology for many decades now. We've shown very nicely that they can happen, experimentally shown that they can happen in shallow lakes, in a whole bunch of mesocosms. And we also have a large amount of theory that says alternative stable states can happen in many different systems. Now, the big limitation that all of these systems and these models have in common is that they tend to be rather simple, or specifically they have really strong feedback processes between just a couple of strongly interacting variables. So what happens in more complicated ecosystems, or in large ecosystems? Okay, we have, for example, environment varying across space, both within local communities and across a landscape. We have not just two species, but usually we have many different species, all interacting in these kinds of dense networks. And of course, as we start thinking about kind of conservation and ecosystem degradation, we also have human societies. As they're experiencing this degradation, we're adjusting how we interact with ecosystems. Okay, so social and ecosystem dynamics become intertwined. Okay, so how do we solve this kind of challenge? So my research program started off quite a while ago. So that's me in the red shirt there, with my parents being field ecologists. And so my form of, rebellion, I guess, was mathematics. And so a big arm of my research has been to develop this kind of long-standing ecological theory that we have to greater levels of biological complexity. Okay, so what are the, kind of classical theories and models that we have, like Lee effects, alternative stable states? Which of them actually, we also find them in complex systems like a landscape or a network? What are the new kinds of dynamics and patterns that emerge when we look at more complex systems in theory? Okay, and what are the new ways we should be looking at complex systems to understand them? Now, this kind of theoretical approach also gives me a lot of intuition about how specific systems work, what can drive patterns that we see in real data. And so the second arm of my research, which is kind of a really fun puzzle solving component, is bringing together theory with large-scale field data. So we can test hypotheses about how it is that the system works by fitting and evaluating different mechanistic models. And of course, there's also, I point out, there's a very important feedback from applying theory to data to developing new theory, because that is how we learn what processes are important in nature and in what combination. Okay, this is sometimes a little underappreciated because we like to just develop theory based on what the physicists did. But what works in physics is usually the really nice mathematics, and what's really nice and elegant mathematically is usually turns out to be true in nature. In biology, we have evolution that creates a whole lot of complexity. So a lot of the time, the very simple answers are not the right ones. We get really bizarre things happening. So the work I've done has kind of spanned this gradient. It's been on population conservation, understanding invasive species dynamics and epidemics. But the core focus is, again, understanding ecological resilience and alternative stable states. So I'm telling you today about how my research expands resilience theory to large ecosystems. I want to start by showcasing how this kind of approach of combining theory and landscape data can resolve whether alternative stable states are relevant or are not relevant in some of these large complex ecosystems where we can't do experimental manipulations. So one of the easiest ways, or easiest in terms of data, of asking, do we have alternative stable states in a system, is to look at its patterning across space. Okay, so do we see different places in a landscape exhibiting different states at the same point in time? So recent research has really nicely worked out how alternative stable states can pattern environmentally homogeneous ecosystems like this grassland, shrubs, vegetation system in the Niger. Okay, so we have alternative stable states, and we have these plants creating self-organized, really regular patterning. So that's really nice. But the great majority of the systems that we work on exist on top of an underlying environmental template. Okay, so that's also driving patterns in the system. So most of the systems we might be working on, they have both the patterning depends both on variation in the environment and any possible effect of feedback processes and alternative stable states. Okay, so we're going to have to disentangle the role of environment and biological feedback. So as you might have guessed, I'm going to be talking to you a fair bit about kelp forests, which occur all around the world's coastlines. And in many of the places where we've been studying them, which are those purple dots, we see that they go back and forth between a kelp forest state, which again has lots of big foundation species, lots of species uniquely associated with it, and an urchin barren. So how are these regimes patterned on landscapes? So in California, if we look at kelp forests in green, urchin barrens in blue, we find that if we go on any spot on the coastline, the entire reef is going to be dominated either by kelp or by urchins. Okay, so we have patchiness in the system on the scale of kilometers. Go to New Zealand, though, we find that on the same reef, we usually find kelp forests in deeper areas running alongside urchin barrens in shallow areas. And it's between these two zones that you find patchiness, but this patchiness is on a very fine spatial scale. These really fine mosaics of like a stand of kelp there and a little patch of urchin barren here. It's very small scale pattern. So why this difference? This is what I got to work on, and why this difference? Do we have alternative stable states in kelp forests? So I got to work on this with my advisor, PhD advisor, Marissa Basket, and a great team of kelp ecologists. And as we go back to alternative stable states, remember, they're driven by feedback processes. And here it's that when we have more kelp, that leads to less herbivory on any given kelp plant, that leads to a further increase in kelp plants. So the way this decline in herbivory actually happens is that urchins can shift from actively eating plants to just passively sitting down and hiding in rock crevices and just eating the bits of kelp that fall to them. Okay, so those rock crevices, they're very nice. They're sheltered from storms, they're sheltered from predators. Things are nice. But there's two reasons why this shift in behavior can happen. One of the reasons is that kelp plants can move around with the motion of the water a whole heck of a lot. Okay, so when you have periods of intense wave activity, the plants move so much that they physically whack the urchins and push them back. Okay, so this is an effect called whiplash. It is totally real, measured in labs and in the field. Okay, so that's one thing that can happen, but this kind of feedback is happening on a very small spatial scale. okay, on the scale of meters, because the plants aren't all that big. The other thing that can happen, though, is kelp can form really large canopies, and periodically water motion will tear off some of these leaves, and gradually they drift down to the urchins on the bottom. Okay, so these kelp leaves, these detrital subsidies, drift across the entire reef. Okay, so if you have a lot of kelp on the whole reef, you might see all the urchins across the reef getting subsidies and not grazing. But if kelp across the reef decline, all the urchins across the entire reef suddenly start grazing. So again, a feedback in urchin grazing behavior, but it happens over a large spatial scale. It depends on kelp densities over the entire reef. So why do we have this larger scale of kelp patterning in California? One explanation is that we have feedbacks and the resulting alternative stable states in California happening over larger spatial scales. The other explanation is that we have more intensive environmental variation in California. We have these big storms and big pulses of urchin recruitment happening periodically that we don't have in New Zealand. So you can tease apart, is it environment or is it feedbacks and alternative stable states by comparing how well each feature can explain the field data when we plug it into a dynamical model. So the data we're going to be using is about 150 reefs, close to 20,000 samples across New Zealand and California. What's really important is that they span hundreds of kilometers of coastlines, so we're sampling above the scales of variation in ocean climate. But also within each reef, we have samples from a range of water depths. So that spans the gradient in wave stress. The shallower you go, the more wave stress there is on kelp. So it's important that we span a broad range of environments. So now we can write down a model for what determines how much kelp we have on any given spot. That's going to depend on recruitment and environment, like nutrients, competition of plants for light, wave stress ripping out adult plants, and urchins eating kelp. Okay, now there's two things that can happen. Without behavior, we have just this kind of type 1 functional response, which just says when we have more kelp get eaten. In models that have behavior, we're saying that when we have lots of kelp, the number of kelp that get eaten actually goes down. Okay, and it can go down when we have a lot of kelp in a little spot for local feedbacks in grazing behavior, or the amount of kelp that gets eaten goes down when we have a lot of kelp across the entire reef for reef scale feedbacks in behavior. So now we can include crosshair in this model to account for the whole bunch of things that affect kelp seedling spore survival that we don't really know very fiddly, and fit the steady states of this model to data. So what we find, California, there's not much of an effective environment. The model that best explains what we see is a model of this reef scale feedback in urchin grazing behavior. What does that mean? So our best fit model predicts that if we look at the total amount of kelp across the entire reef and look across how that depends on the amount of urchins that we have across the entire reef, we might, for the same urchin density, we might see lots of kelp, all of the urchins grazing passively, or the same amount of urchins grazing actively and no kelp. Okay, so alternative stable states across the entire reef. And the data in blue here line up very well with that model. In New Zealand, we see a bigger effective environment, but the best model combines the effect of environmental variation and local scale feedbacks in urchin behavior. So what this means is that if we go out on any reef in New Zealand, this model predicts only urchin barrens in the wave swept shallows, only kelp forest states in the wave sheltered deep areas, and in between these boundaries, the model is predicting alternative stable states. Okay, so now with this model, if you look at how much kelp you have across the reef, and how that depends on the amount of urchins you have on the reef, we see a little bit of alternative stable states, but they're not very distinctive because they're only affecting those intermediate water depths. Okay, and again, the data line up very well with this. So the thing that drives patterning and alternative stable states in kelp forests, very shockingly, is actually animal behavior. Okay, so kind of one of the most iconic examples of patterning that we have, and the reason is to a large extent the behavior of urchins, what they decide to do. Okay, and so, and as we've seen, based on the model comparison, the effect of urchin behavior takes precedence over the effects of environment or the actual amount of urchins that we have in determining whether we have a kelp forest or an urchin barren. And we also see that with larger scale feedbacks in urchin grazing behavior that we have in California. These large subsidies in urchins across the entire reef grazing actively or passively, that corresponds to less resilience of the kelp forest. We can have urchin barrens spanning entire reef in California. And again, we show evidence for alternative stable states in both of these regions. So we're kind of just unraveling a longstanding debate in kelp forests. And the other thing, the last thing I want to point out here is that we're able to get these insights into what is it that is driving this processes in the system and patterning by looking collectively at patterns in the system across environmental gradients, in this case, urchin density. So this is in fitting mechanistic models to that. So this is a very fun approach I've also gotten to do with epidemics, COVID-19, leveraging gradients and spread rates. So their spread rate was about 5 times higher in big cities compared to the countryside. And leveraging that gradient to build COVID models and test different mitigation strategies. What spatial scales should we do lockdowns at? And also for understanding the species invasions here with quagga and zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. So those species now comprise about 98% of all the biomass in these lakes. So the first approximation, the animals in the Great Lakes are invasive mussels. But we're using hundreds of sites and leveraging the resource gradients that these sites span to back estimate mussel demography and model the transients and the invasion dynamics. Okay, so this is kind of a classic with this green curve. You have this overshoot of carrying capacity, and then it settles down. You have this transient in the population invasion. But if you look at the x-axis, it's spanning many, many decades. Okay, so it's kind of a cool and nutty system in that way. But going back to alternative stable states, we've shown that they can happen when even in complex spatial systems when we have these tight interactions between kelp and urchins. What about diverse systems? With many species, does diversity beget resilience? Again, the idea is that theory predicts we have alternative stable states in many systems where we have these tight feedback loops between just a couple of species. But what about the fact that in many systems, species are embedded in these broader interaction networks? Okay, so do those interaction networks dissipate these feedback processes across many species and prevent alternative stable states? So the kind of network I want to look at for this are food webs. Okay, so often in these systems, we're harvesting the top consumers. Sometimes we see that with a lot of harvest, these consumer populations suddenly collapse. These fisheries suddenly collapse, and they stay collapsed even after we stop fishing. Okay, so this is consistent with the idea that we're falling off a cliff that we expect from alternative stable states, and making things a little bit better does not improve things at all. And of course, the other reason we want to understand and anticipate these kinds of persistent consumer collapses is because they propagate throughout the food web and have dramatic ecosystem consequences. So when you lose herbivores on a coral reef, macroalgae take over. So I wanted to address this question of how is it that diversity mediates food web resilience in a very kind of cross-system manner. And the first problem we have is that we don't really have one model of consumer collapse in food webs. We have dozens of different models that look at different processes, look at completely different species, and about the only thing they, at first glance, the only thing they have in common is they're all predicting alternative stable states, and they're all looking at just 2 species. So using analytical approaches, I condense all of these models down to 2 characteristic types. Okay, one of them says that consumer populations collapse when abundant resources deplete consumer recruitment. Okay, what does that mean? It means the resources outcompete or just consume the babies of the consumers, or the resources overgrow the habitat, like a coral, that consumers need to live on. The other class of models says that consumers collapse when abundant resources become harder to eat. Okay, so that depletes energy output. We've seen one example with whiplash, group defense in kelp forests. Another really common thing that happens is when resource populations get abundant, they usually also become dominated by really large individuals, so large-bodied, harder to eat. So knowing this, we can now put together a food web model. We have a guild of resources and a guild of consumers. We have mortality, that is kind of the main thing in which we're impacting food webs, consumer mortality. And we're also going to have species demographic traits that vary across different species. What this means is that some consumers are going to be more vulnerable to mortality and collapse at lower levels of mortality than other consumer species. So they respond differently to this press disturbance. Now we can include things of food web connectance topology, and I'm going to be showing you robustness results averaged over 120 replicate food webs. So different food web structures and different randomly chosen traits of all these species. And again, we're going to focus on comparing models where consumer feeding declines with resource abundance or consumer recruitment declines with resource abundance. So first, let's look at what happens in the system as we progressively remove more and more consumers, and specifically how removing consumers affects the ecological functioning of the system that is promoting consumer persistence. Okay, so one of the functioning is the survival of consumer recruits, averaged over all consumer species. So if we look at that, we see that that drops off as we go right to left, only when we lose the last few remaining consumer species. This signals that consumers have more redundant roles in the system. Okay, and this is because having high good recruitment conditions requires only that the total abundance of all resources is low. So we can achieve that with just a few dominant consumer species. If we look at resource edibility, averaged over all resources, so this is how much energy the consumers are taking up, we see that that declines more in proportion to the number of consumer species we have left. Okay, so this kind of linear thing is signaling that consumers have more specialized roles in promoting the persistence of the consumer good. Okay, and the intuition here is that high feeding requires that each and every resource is at a low abundance. This is something that just a few consumers can't achieve by themselves. Okay, so now let's look at what happens as we stress this food web with really high levels of consumer mortality. So instead of removing one species at a time, we're just cranking up mortality on all of these species at the same time. Okay, so I'm going to be showing you the abundance of individual consumer species at the top and the total abundance of the consumer guild at the bottom. So first, with the kind of more redundant, as we've seen, recruitment feedbacks, as we gradually crank up mortality, we see that there's a point at which the entire guild collapses. And as we gradually dial down mortality, there's a very different point at which the entire guild recovers. With the more specialized feeding feedbacks, we see that that collapse point happens much earlier, but also as we reduce mortality by just a little bit, again, the whole thing recovers. So overall, alternative stable states span a broader range of conditions with these kind of more redundant recruitment feedbacks. So why is that? Let's recap. Why does the presence of alternative stable states in a food web depend on the kind of feedback that we're looking at? Well, as I mentioned, when we have trait diversity, what that translates to is that we have some species more vulnerable to the disturbance. So they decline at lower levels of mortality than other species. It's sort of by definition. And when we have these kinds of specialized feeding feedbacks, and species have unique contributions to persistence of the community, when we start losing those most vulnerable species, that cascades out to the collapse of the whole system. When we have these kinds of more redundant feedbacks, the function that was provided by the species we lose can be filled in by other species. So diversity does not beget resilience. Alternative stable states can still happen in really diverse systems, like a coral reef, but only through a specific set of feedback processes. Okay, so specifically when different species in a guild improve conditions in similar ways. So they're promoting a habitat-forming species like corals, or they're alleviating some shared stressor, or when species traits are adaptive and they can change their diet, for example. And what this means empirically is that as we go out into a diverse system and we try to kind of measure all the different processes and anticipate how much resilience it has, how strong are these feedback processes, does it have alternative stable states? The kinds of feedbacks that we should prioritize are these redundant ones that affect recruitment of consumers, for example. So the other thing this shows is that with high levels of anthropogenic stress like harvest, even really diverse ecosystems could be in trouble. And so making our reliance on them sustainable might require kind of backing away from these tipping points. Okay, so reducing the amount of impact and stress that we're having on ecosystems. Okay, so that's nice, but this is usually where classical resilience theory stops. We have this control knob in the system, and if we just fine tune it, everything is going to be good. What this sort of misses is that in most systems, how much anthropogenic impact we're having as a society depends not just on some central governing agency. A lot of the time, it depends on the collective decisions and actions of many different individuals and stakeholders. Okay, and so this has sort of been more recently kind of the driver of many kind of really wicked environmental problems. Okay, we're trying to reduce our impacts on ecosystems, but this is a really lengthy process because it takes, we have to get many people aware of the problem and get them on board with mitigating their impacts. And sometimes there are substantial perceived costs that people see of reducing their impact. And so this takes time and timescales on which it's taking us a while to get society on board with mitigation, but on those timescales, ecosystems are also changing. So as an example, I'm going to focus on algae blooms, for example, in Western Lake Erie. As you might know, early 1970s, there's kind of one of the big conservation success stories. We had massive algae blooms in Western Lake Erie, but most of it was due to pollution that was just coming from a few coastal sources. So we had kind of top-down action by the government. We fixed these main sources of pollution, and water quality improved. But now algae blooms are coming back. And this is because of climate change exacerbating the impacts of the remaining pollution that we have. And the remaining pollution is coming from farms all across the watershed. Okay, so this is one of those scenarios where we have to get, for example, a lot of farmers on board with reducing fertilizer use, for example. And yeah, as I mentioned, this is a lengthy process. It takes time on which the ecosystems and the services they provide can also change. Okay, so now focusing on the human dimension of ecosystems, I put together a team for my first postdoc. I put together a team of social and political scientists to ask how, when we include humans in our equation, how do human societies shape resilience? Okay, so start with the question of at what point does human societal changes in human behavior, at what point does it start affecting resilience of an ecosystem, right? In this idea of alternative stable states. Well, as you probably know, a lot of the time there's quite a length of time between when we're putting unsustainable levels of degradation stress on a system, between that time and the time at which people actually learn about it and start thinking about, oh, maybe this is a problem, maybe I should do something about it, right? Stakeholders considering mitigation. So there's that time delay. And over that time, the services that ecosystems provide are declining. Okay? So sometimes we build infrastructure to substitute for the ecosystem service that we're losing. Okay, so when we tear down marshes, kind of coastal marshes, and we get a lot of erosion stress, big storms battering the coastline, we sometimes want to build just concrete breakwaters, okay, instead of waiting for the time that it takes for marshes to recover. In Lake Erie, one thing that happens is that local economies and property values adapt and decline. So reliance on the lake declines in places where we have intensive algae blooms. Okay. And the other kind of adaptation that often happens is that public attention to environmental issues tends to be kind of ephemeral. Okay, so there's a brief period over which we're kind of concerned about environmental degradation, and then that public attention tends to decline over within a decade from its peak level. Okay. Okay, this is not something unique to environment. This happens with any issues. I'm sure you've seen. We were talking an awful lot about an epidemic a couple of months ago, and we're not anymore. Okay, but looking at environmental issues, often they get mentioned in newspapers in this case. So we surveyed that, and we find this kind of characteristic, outbreak of attention and then decline happening regardless of what time you look at, what state you look at, or whether the problem was solved or not. Okay, so we have this kind of outbreak epidemic type affecting public attention dynamics. But in Lake Erie, we do find that public attention is important to how much, could be important to how much stakeholders are mitigating. So specifically in counties where farmers are more aware of algae blooms on Lake Erie, those are also the places where farmers are doing more voluntary mitigation to reduce nutrient runoff into the lake. So knowing this, we can now kind of put together a truly social ecological model of resilience. So again, most people initially are unaware of the problem. As we're losing the ecosystem service, people learn about it, they become aware and concerned, but gradually over time, they're continuously shifting their attention to other issues. For kind of our economic reliance on the system, we have this kind of very simple memory dynamic, which just says our reliance on the ecosystem is going to increase when there's a surplus of the ecosystem service provided, and it's going to decrease when our reliance exceeds how much service is provided. Okay, all this is saying is, if we go out as a family to the beach every summer, several times every summer, and we're used to doing that, we've been doing that for decades, but now we find there's like a health hazard sign, the stinky algae everywhere. Gradually over time, if this happens often and long enough, we're going to go and do something else. We're going to go hike in a forest or something, right? We're not going to rely or expect that benefit to be there. We're going to change your habits. For the ecosystem service, I'm just using something very simple that says it grows or recovers to a steady state, but it's also experiencing intense levels of degradation. And to some extent, that can be offset by stakeholders committing to mitigation. The proportion of stakeholders that actually commit to mitigation depends on a social learning process. Okay, so this depends on how often individuals reconsider their decisions, mitigate or not mitigate, and how often they run into individuals that are doing something else other than them, right? How often mitigators run into non-mitigators. What they actually decide to do, choose to do when they reconsider, depends on the net payoff of mitigation, okay? So it's going to be higher when the ecosystem service is very valuable or there's a lot of public pressure to mitigate, but it's going to also decline when mitigation is, costs a lot of money. And again, the last key thing we're going to focus on here is on that time delay between when intense degradation starts and when stakeholders start, considering mitigation. Should I be doing this perhaps? Okay, so let's look at first one simulation here with when stakeholders begin to consider mitigating 5 years after intense degradation starts. So at this point, 5 years in, ecosystem service declined. Reliance is still kind of high, it's declining, and public attention is at its peak. Okay, so if mitigation starts here, we see that there's a lot of incentive to go and do things, and the service recovers, our reliance on it recovers, and it's also sustainable because we also have a lot of mitigators now on board, stakeholders now on board with mitigation. Okay, so it's kind of a pristine social ecological state. But if stakeholders wait 10 years to begin mitigating after degradation starts, by this point, reliance has also declined and public attention is low. Okay, so at this point in time, we've waited so long that there's actually not much incentive, not much pressure for stakeholders to increase mitigation. And so mitigation never really takes off, and we're locked into this degraded social ecological state where we're not expecting, we don't have much of a, we've lost that ecosystem service and we're no longer expecting it to be there. Okay, so in the system, we have alternative stable states. Depending on how long we wait, we end up in different regimes. And they're emerging here not from ecological feedbacks. We have kind of, pollution flowing in, it flows out to the rest of the lake, but from kind of the intertwining of ecological processes and social processes, this idea of communities adapting to environmental degradation. So, and you might also see there's kind of a limited time window. So if we have prompt restoration efforts, we manage to restore the system into this pristine state. If we wait too long, we get trapped in a degraded socio-ecological state. There's a limited time window for restoration efforts to be successful. So the longer this time window is, the more resilient the system is. So with this kind of model framework, we can now ask, how do different interventions in the environment and different interventions in societies, how well do they compare in boosting resilience of the system? Okay, and what we find is that societal interventions can be as important as environmental ones. And one kind of broad class of these societal interventions is about slowing how fast we're adapting as a society to losing natural ecosystem services. Okay, so for example, taxing substitute resources, increasing public awareness. And the other class is about boosting the adoption of mitigation by stakeholders, getting them to reconsider their decisions more frequently and open dialogue between stakeholders that have taken different strategies. Okay, and of course, including incentives for mitigation. And so if we look at the evolution of cooperation in bacterial communities and in economics, we also know that one of the ways to get this kind of cooperation, get it off the ground, is using institutions. Okay, so institutions like laws, if you put too much, if you pollute too much, you get fined. Things like social norms, if you're kind of off base with the rest of what the rest of society is doing, you get kind of this punishment or negative pressure that way. Okay, and looking at these kinds of institutions with legally binding climate agreements in this case, I've recently looked at that, and what I found is that it's actually important to kind of combine these kind of grassroots efforts, for example, social norms for mitigation across local communities, with large-scale efforts, for example, statewide policy efforts to promote mitigation. So putting this all together, we've seen that alternative stable states can happen and prevent recovery, erode resilience, even in some of these really complex systems. And because through our kind of focus and interest in alternative stable states, we've also seen that they can happen through feedbacks in animal behavior, and we've learned how animal behavior is contributing to landscape patterning in ecosystems. Okay? And we can detect this by combining theory and data across environmental gradients. We've seen that alternative stable states can happen even in really diverse systems, but only through a specific set of processes. And they're more likely actually to happen when we start thinking explicitly about social dynamics and the fact that humans adapt to environmental degradation. Okay, so that makes early action quite important. And I'll just leave you with a little bit of what I'm doing here in Dan's lab. And it's building on that kind of idea of that I talked to you about, resilience, alternative stable states in kelp forests. That was data from about 100 long-term monitoring sites in California. The really cool thing that we have, though, is satellite data on kelp canopy across 4 years and the entirety of the West Coast. Okay, so we really know the state of the whole ecosystem. We can start asking about the geography of the resilience of the kelp forest. Instead of sampling one side and trying to extrapolate what that means for the rest of the system, we actually know the entire system. That's kind of really exciting. And diving into this a little bit, one of the first things I've found so far is this kind of most of the variation in how much kelp canopy you have doesn't come down to like seasonality, like winter, summer, or whatever. You have strong storms in the winter in the ocean, but a whole heck of a lot of it comes down to variation of kelp across very many year timescales. And specifically, we find these very often we find these really strikingly regular cycles in kelp cover over time. Okay? And the other thing that we find is that these cycles are not really synchronized. Okay, so what that means is that one patch might have high kelp in any given year, and in the same year, a patch 3 kilometers away might very likely be in a have low kelp cover. Okay, so this isn't due to some kind of big ocean forcing, right? This is not some large-scale environmental driver. This is due to likely the succession of generations within individual patches. So this idea of cohort cycles, we have really high recruitment potential, lots of spores being produced. And then we have this big cohort of high fecundity and this big cohort of kelp coming in. And they grow up, they shade out all the juveniles for a while until the adults die, and then the next cohort can come in. So you have this kind of high fecundity and really intense competition. So unlike if you have kind of stable level of patch or of kelp abundance, what these cycles are doing is they're creating these regular periods of low kelp abundance. Okay, and as we've seen with the first project, low kelp abundance across the reef can trigger formation of active urchin grazing and the formation of an urchin barren. Okay, so we see these, sometimes we have these cycles and sometimes the system gets trapped in a long run of zero kelp, okay, consistent with an urchin barren. And so the main, one of the interesting questions is that perhaps the spatial scales at which kelp demography varies, like survival, et cetera, might translate to and determine the spatial scales at which we see urchin barrens. Okay, and this is quite interesting in the context of climate change because it's increasing the frequency of and spatial scale of extreme events in the environment, big disturbances. And if that increases the synchrony of cohorts across space, so high abundance coinciding across many patches in the landscape, that could create periods of vulnerability to urchin barrens happening across large swaths of the coastline. So this is kind of over long-term feeding into my kind of really big passion of combining mechanistic models and understanding of ecological dynamics with the landscape data to kind of really bridge community and landscape ecology, and also start kind of bridging, providing the ecological theory that we have to start to understand some of the dynamics that we see in human environment systems to get a data-driven understanding of large-scale ecosystem change. So just want to thank you all so much for listening through all of that. Yeah, I'd love to take your questions. And some of you probably have been postdocs in before or will be postdocs in the future. It's a time when you're kind of shifting around a lot. And which is to say, I'd really love to chat with you about anything science. Yeah, make new friends. And yeah, maybe that leads to a paper. Maybe we just have fun talking about nature. That would be great as well. So I really look forward to meeting many of you in the coming months. Thank you.
You see the hands raised down there? So you can call on people.
I'm going to stop sharing. So, and maybe people can just jump in if you have questions. Let's have the chat box open.
I have a sort of a general question. That was a really good talk. I enjoyed it. On the spatial dimension, one thing that we've been working on in the context of positive plant soil feedbacks, which happen at very local scales, in the dynamics that might come from that in a two-dimensional expansive context like a prairie, is that you can get nucleation, which will then reduce the region over which you actually have effective alternative states because it collapses. Nucleation is a process that will convert a region which you can have two stable states in a mean field model into a much smaller region where you actually will realize alternative stable states in a spatially explicit model. And so my question, after exploring that a little bit, I started wondering whether the paradigm of alternative stable states was overblown in ecology, partly because the environmental driver that determines, in your generic S-shaped model, which the environmental driver creates that, and moves that region of alternative stable states. And if at some scale there is this interactions are local at some scale, and if they do exist in two dimensions where then nucleation is possible, then really these environmental drivers will act as simple flips either way, going either way, rather than the expected model from the mean field S-shaped. And I know that wasn't the direction of that you took your spatial model, but I just since you've done so much thinking about mean field models, I just toss it out there as my general polemic for you.
Yeah.
Vadim, that was kind of a long, I think most people in here couldn't hear it. Is there any way we could challenge you to summarize the question?
Yeah, so I'd have to look a little bit at the model, but yeah, it's this idea that in a lot of plant systems, you have this kind of local facilitation. So there's a positive feedback locally, but then plants at larger distances, they also compete. For example, you're gathering up water around you, you're kind of hoarding it in one spot. But then that means you can always get plants living next to this kind of big plant where that's accumulated water, but farther away, there's never any water, so you can never have plants over there.
Actually, I'll just comment that, Vadim, that's not what I'm talking about. That creates two states, which I consider one state, which is a pattern state. That creates a pattern, but it's different than. Anyway, I'll talk to you another time about what nucleation would do in the context of the spatial model.
Yeah, I would really love to. Yeah, So yeah, I'm just kind of familiar with this. Yeah,
So anyway,
when interactions change sign with distance, so you go from positive to negative, you get this really regular patterning. That's which isn't really alternative stables. It's a little bit different flavor, right?
It's a little different.
Yeah. Gradually change conditions, you get different patterns, but you don't get one regime or the other. When you have positive interactions locally and negative interactions at a larger distance. So some of the kelp forests we've been looking at, they just have kind of positive interactions. So you have kind of lots of kelp, but sometimes you have kind of shocks coming into the system and this kind of environmental variation that's creating these gaps in the system in some place and a stand of kelp in another place. Yeah, there's kind of this intricate interaction between environmental variation and positive feedbacks that's creating patterning in that system, in the kelp system, as opposed to some of these kind of very well-known organized self-pattern systems where you have these difference in the feedback changing sign with distance. So you get these really cool patterning. Yeah. But yeah, I'd really love to talk about that sometime.
Or another time. Thank you. It was a great talk.
So I just have a question on the first part of your talk on the kelp forest and sampling. I'm just curious. I do feel like I'm curious how I feel like there might be a chicken and egg issue of how much urchin grazing is happening versus how much kelp is there. So I wondered how they were sampling the two different traits, like the amount of herbivory versus the amount of standing kelp.
Okay, so the question is, how did we sample urchin grazing intensity in the first? So the answer is we did not. we just looked at how many urchins there are and how many kelp there is. The urchin grazing intensity is something that's inferred, right? We're asking, do we have this type 1 functional response? Does that explain the data? Or do we better explain the data when you have this type 4 functional response that goes high and then it actually declines at high resource densities? Okay, and so that's the overall approach. And one of the cool aspects of the system is that urchin densities don't really depend on how much kelp you have in a spot, because you have larvae coming in from hundreds of kilometers away. It's a very open population. And when we lose, when you lose kelp, urchins, you still can have a lot of urchins. They just shut down reproduction and they live on almost no food for decades. Okay, it's one of those cold-blooded invertebrate type things. But what that means is that urchin populations change very gradually. Kelp populations change very quickly. Kelp grow very quickly, and urchin behavior also grows very quickly. So that's why we can fit a model with just kelp dynamics, because as we go out, sample the system at the end of the growing season, kelp are as abundant as they can be. So either you have lots of kelp, passive grazing, or very little kelp. And yeah.
So I think the question you talked about where you said the diversity doesn't necessarily And I guess, and if there's more, just kind of begs the question of what level of diversity, and I was curious if people were going to have even if sort of diversity might be better for the care of other
Yeah, absolutely. So it's yeah. So the question is, yeah, what kinds of diversity should we be looking at? Like, at what point does diversity actually does increase resilience and contribute to that? Yeah, and so yeah, I think absolutely looking at species functions is really important. In this case, the function is kind of what is your diet for as a consumer? Okay, so which species do you eat? Yeah, so when you add on redundancy in that case, that would be really, yeah, that's one of the things that we want to look at. Yeah.
You mentioned towards the end the possibility that changes in climate were changing the spatial scale of synchrony. And have you tested for that? Have you been able to test for that?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, well, theoretical simulation models, but the idea is you have kinds of, for example, cohort cycles, and some places, and they're different from place to place. Some patch is in a high year of the cohort, another patch is in a low cohort year. Okay, but as you have these kind of, I'm really thinking of like these really big shocks to the system, like all the plants die across a landscape. Okay? What that's doing is it's resetting the whole system to be, now all the patches are 0 kelp in a year, or very low kelp. And so then they start growing and they start going through these cohort cycles simultaneously. So you've kind of reset the system to be all doing the same thing in unison. The other kind of thing that can happen is if you're thinking about these big shocks happening more and more frequently, then a lot of your system, what it's doing is you have much of the system all trying to recover at the same time from a recent shock. So it's kind of that kind of synchrony in that sense.
More questions?
I don't see anything in the chat. Yeah, thank you again. And again, I'd really love to meet any of you in person. That would be really wonderful. Hope that happens soon. Thank you.